let me say this.
Yeah.
I'll give you this tidbit. I think there are two areas. I think that in 10 years, Joe's Valley could be the third best bouldering area in Utah.
Whoa. All right. Welcome to the Testpiece podcast. Jamie Emerson. How's it going, man?
I'm doing well. How are you, Josh?
Good. I'm missing our buddy Tim King. Actually, my buddy Tim King. He's busy as always. But he thought it was okay if he didn't join today because he's from an entire different era. Although maybe that would have been good, having that young blood to ask their own questions.
I would love it if you were here, and I would love to talk to younger climbers about some of their perspectives on the sport and whatnot.
Yeah,
So I'm a little disappointed he's not here.
Tim, come on. Okay, well, next time I'm sure
Yeah.
I'm looking at my list of questions and things to talk about. There could be a next time, so maybe Tim will join us next time. But I guess we have the privilege of being the oldest average age podcast on Testpiece so far. But
Nice.
actually, the other thing that I noticed is, uh, Jamie, you were our first cold outreach. So despite our many mutual friends, I saw that you had I think you followed after Carlo's pod, and I just reached
Mhm.
out because I saw your name and I was like, ooh, let's get Jamie on. So yeah, you're our first cold outreach.
And here I am. Yeah, it is interesting that we did have so many mutual friends, but had never crossed paths before.
Yeah, I guess you were so deep in the Colorado scene, and it's actually somewhat recently that I've even gotten to go to Colorado, despite it being like the Mecca. I got sucked into California, which is not a Mecca, but has a good scene itself. And I'll be honest, Jamie, I knew you as just one word, or I guess two words, as the sheriff, which I don't know how you feel about that title. I don't know. I mean, we'll get into it, but one of the things that we talked about in our little, I don't know if you call it like a pre-interview, a meet and greet,
Mhm.
is how people get known for one little thing, but it doesn't really encompass who they are. And the whole point of a podcast or a long form media like this is we get to really uh, hear all about your opinions, your views. And I guess, is it okay if we start there and ask you, how did you get the name Sheriff? Do you even like it? Should I not say that again for the rest of the podcast? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in terms of how I got the nickname, it actually came from Jimmy Webb. I had met Jimmy a long time ago in the Southeast, and he probably climbed V10 at the time, and he knew me, and he was, hey, I think I know you, and I'm really excited about climbing, and can you tell me what Waco Tanks is like? And we climbed together a few days, and I thought, oh, he'll probably be pretty good someday. He might climb V12, and then in the subsequent years, he just took off, which is awesome to watch. I feel like in some ways a little bit of a father son relation. Just proud to see him thrive so much. But as we got older, I used to give him a hard time because I liked him, and I would give him a hard time about it. It really came down to he did a Ty Landman boulder problem, Midnight Express V14 in Boulder Canyon.
Beautiful climb, by the way. One of the most
Awesome. Yeah,
best lines out
yeah.
there.
Awesome climb. It has a bit of an inobvious start, which is obviously that's always debatable about what's obvious and what's not obvious. But Jimmy started one move in from where Ty started it, which is where a number of subsequent repeaters have started. And I just called him out on it. And I said, you didn't do that boulder. You didn't start where Ty did. I was super direct with him as I can be. And we kind of joked around. And I think his little way of getting me back was calling me the sheriff and saying, "Oh, the sheriff's going to get you." And so that's really where it started. I have been opinionated about things, and I think for some people that fits. I don't really care about the nickname at all. I think that when I think about my own, like when you ask this question, like Jamie, you kind of presented it in the pre-work there, like what does it mean to be the sheriff, or what is that to you? When I think about my whole spectrum of climbing, in no part of that comes up that I'm the sheriff. I think about areas, I think about climbs, I think about quality, I think about grade debates, I think about how to define a boulder problem. All of those things kind of dominate my own thoughts about climbing. And so the sheriff doesn't even come. I mean, if that's what people want to call me, that's, they can, I guess they can do whatever they want, but that's not really what I think of when I think of my own climbing.
It sounds kind of cool. It's not a terrible name. Yeah. Jimmy, sorry, I just got a comment on Jimmy kind
Yeah.
of coming out of nowhere in some ways. I remember he kind of hit the scene when I was pretty deep into climbing. And I just remember him like continuing to level up. It just seemed like, wow, this guy's kind of strong. And then just every year he really got a lot stronger. And it's interesting when you see these people who have this kind of almost linear trajectory where it's like they don't have a ceiling. You know, there's a lot of people who it seems like they will come out, maybe do one hard climb. And I mean, not to say that's not impressive, but it seems like he's still getting better. You know, this kind of hits on some of the theme of our podcast, or one of the themes of our podcast, which is how you go from good to great. And you know, I someday we'll talk to Jimmy because he's just an amazing guy all around. And I'd love to hear his perspective where he leveled up and stayed there, and it seems like he's still pushing forward.
You know, one thing that really stands out to me about Jimmy is that I give him a hard time because I'm like, every time I'm in a bouldering cave, I hear some kid talking about Jimmy Webb. Jimmy Webb did this and Jimmy Webb did that. And oftentimes those conversations are around his power, right? He's an extremely powerful climber. Like his control it's off the charts, right? And I know I spent quite a bit of time climbing with him. When I climb with him, obviously that stands out, but also he's one of the best technical climbers I've ever climbed with. And he's extremely precise. And I think it would be a tough competition between him and Dave Graham as to who is best at figuring out beta. Jimmy is incredible at seeing sequences. And that's a very subtle thing that, you know, you see a lot of strong people climb. I've set and I climbed I've climbed around a lot of strong people over the years. And his ability to discover sequence is second to none. It's incredible. And I think it's really easy to see the power that when he climbs, it's not so easy to see that ability to conjure up a sequence. It makes him a really good flash climber. And if you notice, he has a lot of really impressive flashes.
Yeah, I will say that when I see Jimmy climb, it kind of reminds me a little bit of that love I had for Sharma when I was younger, even though they are very, very different climbers, but that bigger, more powerful look to them, like literally like look to them, is enticing, I think, for younger climbers, younger guys that just
Mm-hmm.
want to, I don't know. I think every kid wants to be burly and powerful, but I really want to echo what you said about him being just an absolute technician and moving beautifully and just, yeah, it's funny because I don't know how to put my finger on it. Maybe we can dive into it more in contrast to guys like Dave, where he just is so precise and he has such body tension. And I think sometimes you see the muscles and you see the yell, but you sometimes miss that subtlety of its power being applied in the most specific, perfect way that really gets him up those hard boulders. Not just, he's not, you know, he's probably not fit, quote unquote stronger than, I don't know, pick one, Daniel Woods or something. Although who knows, he's pretty damn strong. But it's that technique in connection with his strength, and maybe that's what has continued to propel him, is that he had the good technique, and in some ways, getting stronger is just about applying technique better versus just, you know, upping your hangboard numbers.
Yeah, I think Jimmy is just a student of rock climbing, and John Gill used to talk about this kinesthetic awareness, and his kinesthetic awareness is like off the charts. It is really ridiculous. And it's just amazing. He's really a phenomenal climber, and he is, I think, one of the most motivated climbers I've met. I've met quite a few climbers, and his motivation is really impressive. And yeah, I mean, I have a ton of respect for him. He's awesome. I think, going back to the sheriff stuff, I think Jimmy comes from the South, and I think there's a kind of a tradition in the South that you jab a little bit at the people you like. And I think that's probably where it comes from. And that's probably why we get along with each other, because we like to poke fun.
Well, something you wrote in the kind of like little pre-interview thing again, is that you wrote about the importance of defining a boulder problem, and that really stood out to me because you just had that. You shared that little anecdote around Jimmy, quote unquote, starting in the wrong place, and so I know what you're saying there. I'm not trying to be difficult. It's just the idea that there is a wrong place and there is a right place, and what that really means and how that connects to the first ascensionists. I'm just kind of curious what you mean by defining a boulder problem.
Yeah, that is a great question. And to be honest, I think it's one of the most important questions in climbing. Um, the reason is how do we actually know what it is that we're doing? If we want to exist in a world where I can, and maybe it really comes from how do I know what I'm doing? So if I want to go do Midnight Lightning or the mandala, which is one example that I always pull up, which I think is a really great example. I see an article, I see Chris Sharma climb the mandala. I want to do the mandala. How do I know I've actually done the mandala? So we have to understand like what is the mandala? Is it just kind of this vague section of overhang up the boulder that I can just kind of do whatever I want to? If we, I think, allow for that kind of ambiguity, then people will immediately take advantage of it and go, well, I can kind of justify starting wherever I want to. And if we take the argument to the extreme, I can say, well, if it's just a matter of feeling like you did the mandala, then I can feel like I did the mandala sitting at home. Why would I even go to Bishop? I watched a video of Chris do it, and I can imagine what Chris probably felt like. So cool, I did the mandala. So I don't think that people really want to exist in a sport where that stuff is, oh, that's okay. That we can kind of really constantly blend the rules because people will take more and more and more, I think, over time. And they've kind of demonstrated that they will do that. So if we want to understand how do we define a boulder problem, I think it's really important to look at where the first ascensionists started. Because Chris walked up to that rock and he started where he started and he said, that's the mandala. And while that sounds really basic, that does kind of define where the boulder problem begins. And kind of what follows from that is we have specific starting holds that you should be starting on, which are the same starting holds as the first ascensionist. So let me just stop there because there's a lot that we're gonna. But I'd love to just hear a response. I'd love to just kind of we can linger on this for.
So I feel called out because I'm one of those people who did the mandala in the way that was not how Chris did it. And in addition to that, I topped out the mandala. I mantled on top of the mandala, and then it was covered in snow, and I unmantled and dropped off. So I am. And then I put on my scorecard right as a V12 too, which everyone said was inflated, but it was my first one. I was very proud of myself. It's interesting because, and I don't really have a problem. It is way. I mean, this is what I think is interesting is, you have these sports are kind of arbitrary, right? And so I don't know, you could talk about football and it's like, why is the field 100 yards long? It's like, because that's what we decided it to be. And so I'm really interested in putting constraints on, but I also think it's really fun to then when you get obsessed with things to play in those little gray areas. And I think that's, to use a Tristan word, that's like the sports center. It's like it's hitting a home run in the Denver stadium the same as in the Giants stadium and all this stuff that's fun to like dive into the details. But it definitely becomes important when you start having professionals and money around. But I guess my pushback would be, what do you say to people who are like soul climbers? They say like, look, it's just a piece of rock and I'm going to start where I wanted to start. And because that's a big background in climbing. I think we've both been climbing long enough to be from a time where maybe even talking about grades was taboo. It was kind of like didn't matter, even though you all secretly felt like it mattered. And just I don't know, I think it's an interesting topic. I want to scratch a little deeper on it.
Yeah. So this is I'm really glad that you brought this point up because this is the kind of typical pushback that I receive. Hey man, why do you care so much? I'm just out here enjoying the rocks. That's fine. I'm not ever saying, and ultimately these, it would be nice, I think, if these rules extended to everyone else, but they are kind of my ethics, I guess, or the way that and I think it does provide a logical system for if I want to repeat a boulder, how do I go do that? Um, yeah, if you're a soul climber, go have fun. Go climb naked, go climb in bare feet. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Start wherever you want. But I think that when you start making claims, like I climbed this boulder, okay, then a claim needs evidence to support that claim. And so then we have to talk about definitions. I think it follows from making the claim about having repeated something or done something, it kind of an iterative process of like, if I'm going to do it, then what does that mean to do it? And it just came from my wanting to understand like what I was actually doing outside. Like I'm going to Red Rocks to try to climb, lethal design. So what does that mean to climb lethal design? Okay, well, I want to make sure I'm starting in the right place. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean where the guidebook says I should start? Does that mean where all the YouTube videos say I should start? What does that actually mean? And so I wanted to understand for myself what that actually meant to repeat a boulder problem. And like I said, if you want to go and hang out and just climb on rocks, do whatever, do drugs, be naked, like I said, just have the most soulful experience ever. If that's what's soulful for you, by all means, go crazy. But I think it changes when people start making claims. And I think that I want to add this one point.
Yeah.
I think that those claims are super important to our sport because I've often argued that I think the greatest achievement in rock climbing ever was Lynn Hill freeing the nose. And so what does that mean to, if we're going to hold this achievement up high, what does that actually mean? Did she just aid climb through it? Did she free climb all the pitches? Did she lead all the pitches? Did she do it? Like all those questions follow from that. And I think if we give all those questions good structure and good definitions for all the terminology that we're using, we have a really good understanding of what it means when someone achieves something. What does it mean to flash a V14 or a V15? As far as I know, we haven't seen a V15 flash yet. What does that mean for someone to flash a V15? So what does it mean to flash a boulder problem? What does it mean? What is a boulder problem? It's just, I think, breaking it down really specifically to understand exactly what, and that's the reason why, like, I can have that personal ethic for myself, but I think it's a nice ethic for everyone because it gives the sport structure in these achievements that we huge news lately, right? Will Bosey climbs Burden of Dreams. What does that mean to climb Burden of Dreams? Does he have to wear the same shoes that Nale wore? Is it the same boulder problem because it's no longer in a forest? Like there are all these, is it okay to put a fan on? Nale probably didn't use fans. All these questions that flow from like what it is that we're actually doing and what's okay. And if we allow for everything, then what does it mean to say that I repeated Burden of Dreams? So I think that's kind of where all this stems from.
I love what you just brought up there on Burden of Dreams and shoes and fans, because I think that's where I just want to dig into deeper, not because I'm trying to, I'm trying to find those constraints or those boundary conditions and understand what it means to define the boulder. Because when people lay these claims, I think what feels like for me is when I made an 8A and I put climbs on 8A, it was me publicly stating my ethic, right? Like I'm like, this is what I thought the climbing grade was. This is my experience, and it's why I think video is valuable too, because if you really put yourself out there transparently and you say like, hey, when I did the mandala, I started like this and I stacked 3 pads, right? Like, but then it also gets into this like, well, what if you're too short and you have to do a jump start or on something? What if the temps are really high? What if the ground eroded? And I'm not exactly like looking for you to tell me exactly what to do in each of those scenarios, but it does. It's like a never ending dive. And I'm not against that. I just am curious if you have any principles that kind of let you tackle when fans come up, or like, what about knee pads? Like what we say with knee pads, or sticky rubber or downturn shoes, even like how do we think about that?
Yeah. So let's go back to your original point of like, if the ground is lower than, or someone's shorter, like the ground doesn't always lower on a boulder problem, although sometimes it does. But let's say you're a short climber, you're a junior kid and you want to do the mandala. How do I know where to start? And what I think when we define things, so I have a kind of I wouldn't say extensive, but I have a mathematical background. And I think about when in math, we talk about things like generalization. And generalization, the way people kind of use it in layman terms is to say, well, just in general, climbers are motivated or something. That's like, that doesn't mean that all climbers are motivated. It's just kind of like relatively most climbers are motivated. But in mathematics, we would say very specifically in general, and it means for all cases, right? And so we want a definition that applies in all cases. And I think that by defining a boulder problem by the starting holds, that allows for all cases. In that, I would think it's like, I remember when Ashima climbed Power Silence and she got, I think, a power spot, or but she got boosted into the starting holds, which I thought was great because then she started at the same place that everyone else started. And I think that's totally fine. I didn't have a problem with that at all.
Didn't
So I think,
sorry, I just
yeah,
wanted that's a really interesting boulder because I thought that she climbed it differently, like up the seam.
she did.
Yeah, like so. What happens there?
So I think the kind of conclusions that I've come to is that we define the starting hold specifically, the middle of the boulder, unless otherwise specifically defined as a contrivance. So the first ascensionist could say, I'm not using the crack or something, and I'm just using the holds to the, like, I think there's that, what's that? There's a V9 in Red Rocks. It's very crimpy. It starts on the plumber's crack and it traverses right. I can't think of the name of it right now,
I don't
but it
know.
starts on a big crack. And basically you can kind of use the crack, but it's a contrivance off the crack. And so, if, unless the first ascensionist specifically says you can't use this crack or you can't use this hold, then the game of climbing is you get to figure out your beta. And I think that's a really nice way to approach that. That allows for, people can come up with creative solutions. And then this is something that I've gotten a lot of pushback about, but I define the end of a boulder problem as the highest point on the boulder. So for the past 15 years, every time I top out a boulder, I go to the highest point, because that's a clear definition, a clear way to say I've actually finished the boulder. It does mean that I walk around the other side of the boulder and take, 30 feet up some 5-2 slab, but I do it every time to get to the top.
I,
So that again, a general rule for all boulders that you can say, I just get to the top.
I personally love the glory top outs of like V2, like easy ones. Yeah, that power silence. I would actually argue, actually, first of all, power silence, really hard boulders shut me down. I had a trip to Waco where I was climbing and flashing like double digits, like doing great. Still couldn't do power silence. Really bothered me.
Yeah, V10 is really hard.
Whew, good one. A really, really cool climb too. And I would actually argue that a climb that has multiple ways up it within, I guess, some kind of like general area that's not like, you traverse to 20 feet to the left is actually the mark of a really good boulder or good sequence where there's multiple sequences of roughly the same difficulty that allow for different body types, different strengths or weaknesses. I think that actually makes for really good boulders where, there's not just one, you can only do it this way. Although I will say sometimes it's really fun when there's just kind of like a mandatory, like you got to jump, something like that.
I think it's really important when we define a boulder problem to allow for that, because it's such an important part of all of our experiences is figuring out beta and going through that problem solving. I think that's super important. So I think it should allow for that to happen. Let's say this. Let me go back to this too. Let me touch on this Midnight Express. So why are they starting higher? It's not because it's harder, right? They're not. No one ever starts in a higher place because it's harder. They almost certainly start in a higher place because it's easier. And so I would argue that they're doing something not only that's easier, arguably, but it's also less than what the first ascensionists did. And so they're doing less. I don't mean to direct this specifically at you, Josh, but they're doing this. This is a philosophical argument. They're doing less than what the first ascensionist has done and claiming that they've done the same.
Yeah.
And to me, that logically doesn't fly.
Yeah. I think I always have this idea that the more people climb a boulder, the more info we have about the boulder, and you can see people starting to break sections down. And the reason why I bring that up is that I think that there's room. I'm curious to see what you think of this, because it could be like an affront to the first ascensionist. Sometimes I'll climb a boulder and it will be clear that there was maybe a better start. You say like, oh, there was a jug start 2 moves in. And so then people start climbing that, or, they start like doing that. And I guess the reason why I'm okay with that is because I think you have, there just becomes this consensus. It's like a living thing. But you don't want to consider that, when I say I climbed a mandala, I didn't climb Chris's mandala. And so, should I call it something different? But you know what I mean? Like how there's sometimes these natural outgrowths of a thing. And yeah, do you think that's like an affront to the first ascensionist? Do you think that's just like something cool and interesting, or how do you tackle that?
Yeah, these are really great questions. So I really appreciate you asking these because they really get at the heart of what I'm trying to convey. So when we look at a problem, like I think I don't know if you use the word obvious, but I feel like you at least alluded to like maybe there's a more obvious start. Like that's kind of that's when these situations happen. That's what we see, right? Well, the first ascension started in this super funky place, and it's just more obvious to start on the jug. I would say, how do we define obvious? For what's obvious for Dave Graham, who has a crazy brain and is an outside the box thinker, in my mind, I've walked up to boulders and thought, why did he start? That's not an obvious place for me to start. But also, there's a couple points to that. Number one is that Dave has earned the right to start wherever he wants because he was there first. And so he gets to determine how he wants to start it. He's also done, I mean, I think that's the better argument. The less better argument is that he has so much experience. And who am I to say that Dave Graham doesn't know what he's doing in terms of where he starts? He has more experience than almost anyone. So maybe he knows something that I don't know through that experience. But going back to the first point, I think you earn the right to decide where the boulder starts. If someone wants to start lower, totally fine. And they can rename a new first ascent, which is what we see all the time. Better eat your Wheaties. Fred sits down and does Crown of Aragorn. Renames the problem. And oftentimes there's a convention that, he could have called it Better Eat Your Wheaties Sit Start. But I think he gets the right to name the boulder as the first ascensionist. If it starts higher, people are free to do that. They're more than welcome. And again, this is where, but they could maybe even say something like, I'm climbing the Wheaties stand start, but they're not doing Better Eat Your Wheaties. And I think to your point too, as well, and I'd like to expand on this a little more, but having the capability to video every climb is super important. So if you're honest about what you've done, I think that's fine too.
It's interesting that you brought up this naming convention. We interviewed Jared Roth maybe a month back. Really cool guy, by the way, just awesome guy.
Yeah, it's a great podcast. I listened to it.
Thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. He did Rastaman Vibration, which is the stand start of lucid dreaming, and I think that there's just something interesting there where when you do a stand start and the crux move on the stand start is the crux move of the climb, does that somehow change like I guess I think he wasn't super excited. I don't want to put words in his mouth. It was just like a feeling I got that maybe he felt like the name Rostamam Vibration Sit was more appropriate for that climb. And again, Jared, if you're listening, you can come on and correct me. I think I'm putting words in his mouth there. But it's now known that kind of lucid dreaming, I'd say Rastaman Vibration is kind of, lost to history in a way. But that's the crux of the climb. And so is there anything there? I don't know. This is way esoteric. This is going off way on a tangent.
Great. These are great questions. Yeah. These are great questions. I think I would say, first of all, Jared is an amazing person and what a great contributor to climbing. And it was awesome that you guys had him on and to just listen to the things he had to say. I love that. I think that in the best scenario, we can have ethics and we can also be nice people. And we can say, for example, Paul could have, gone to Jared and said, I know you did this first. Do you have a preference on what you'd like to name it? One example that I kind of ran into once is that I actually showed Daniel Woods a boulder problem, and it was a really nice boulder problem. He did the first ascent. I had been trying it for a couple of years. He did the first ascent and he said, "Hey, Jamie, what do you want to name it?" And I thought, Daniel, that's totally unnecessary. You did the first ascent, you get to name it. And he's like, no, I want to be a nice person and I just want to let you name it. And so I was like, all right, well, fine, I'll name it. And he doesn't have to do that, but I think that's a really nice thing for us to do. And I think, there could be a level of respect held there by someone approaching someone like Jared and saying, hey, I know you did this first. You were here a long time ago. Do you have a preference on what we call the sit start? I'd like to include you in that.
That's a cool story. Daniel is a really nice guy. It just shows also there's some abundance mentality
Yeah.
there he holds of, I mean, let's face it, he's got many amazing FAs under his belt. And I kind of like that he doesn't, he's not so greedy with that either. Just he's really out there doing amazing things, and just kind of cool to hear that. I like that little story.
It's just like those little stories like that. Like Daniel is such a kind-hearted person, and I would never ask him to rename it or anything like that. I just showed him the project because I was like, he'll just do it. It's probably V13 or V14. He'll just do it right away. And it took him a couple hours and he did it. But yeah, just, I think there's a space for the first ascensionist to reach out to the person who did like all have text message, Instagram. We can all get in touch with each other. Why not just say, hey, do you have a preference for this? But I don't think they're obligated to, because they are doing a new first ascent.
I also kind of have a thing for, I kind of have a thing for good names in general. I actually think it adds to the quality of the boulder. And
Yeah.
I love when lower starts kind of have just a little nod to the stand start, like the one that's coming to my mind, because I was thinking of Return of the Sleepwalker, but next to that, there's Wet Dream. And that was done by Ethan Pringle, but someone added like kind of a low start, and they called, I think it might've been Jimmy actually. And it was Nocturnal Emissions. And I just thought it's just kind of like, yeah, I thought that was, a nice little nod and homage to the original.
Yeah. Again, I don't think that's required, but I also think that it can be kind of a fun way to approach your own climbing and to give a nod to the first ascensionist. And I think, those first ascents are, it's so important, I think, that we respect the fact that someone was there first. Someone was there and saw the line, saw the climb, while everyone else was off doing something else. Someone was right there doing something new, forging a new path for climbing in general. And so I think, it's nice when we can give a little nod to the first ascensionists.
So all of this to me there's a bit of a segue here into, I'm just going to say, aesthetics. And along that lines, I know that you're also a prolific developer, and it's something you love doing. Maybe it's also why you get along with Jimmy, or maybe you helped infect him with that love of hiking and developing. And those seem like two separate things, developing and aesthetics, but this is all intertwined to the idea of what's an obvious start? What makes for a 5-star boulder? Yeah. Why did we say obvious, or why do jug starts even matter? And I guess, there's a lot of directions we can take that, but I would love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on aesthetics, and I'm sure that will lead into your experience in developing.
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing, just touching on that idea, Graham is such an outside the box thinker that he would look at a place where I would start a boulder and be like, why on earth would you start there? That doesn't make any sense at all. And for me, it was the obvious place, but for him, it was not obvious. So I think it's important to remember that every person's experience is different. But if Dave is there first, then he gets to decide where it starts. So yeah, to your point, just about aesthetics and developing, I think that when I moved to Colorado, which was 2001, I thought everything had already been climbed. I was like, Flagstaff, Morrison, Horsetooth Reservoir, and there's this new bouldering area in Chaos Canyon, and everyone's already looked everywhere. And what I quickly discovered was that no one has looked anywhere, and there were hundreds and thousands of boulders that had not been climbed on, and I couldn't believe that oftentimes the new boulders were even better than the things that we were seeing before. And so that wildly motivated me to go start looking for other places, because all I could think is, what else don't I know? What else could be out there? It could be Chaos Canyon was 1,000 times more. I couldn't have dreamed that place up in a million years, that there would, because at the time, no one was really going in the mountains to boulder. If they were, it was maybe roadside, but not in the big mountains, not hiking 2 miles. People thought that was crazy that you're hike 2 miles to go bouldering. That's nuts. Why would you do that? Bouldering is just practice climbing. But it was a completely new paradigm, and it really opened my eyes to like what could be out there. And
Can I
I
ask you
think, oh,
really?
go ahead. Yeah, yeah,
I just
yeah.
want to. I got a question about the status of Upper Chaos and if it
Oh,
will ever
yeah,
open
sure.
again, or any. Do you have any behind the scenes knowledge on that?
Yeah. So I maintain a relationship with the ranger, the climbing ranger there. And the climbing ranger is someone who's a dedicated boulderer, dedicated trad climber. I mean, it's not just some person in an office who doesn't really know what's going on. They know exactly what's going on. They've informed me that it closed indefinitely. The rock slide is really unstable.
Oh,
Last year, I hiked up the ridge, which is legal to do. You can hike just outside the zone up the shoulder of Otis Peak, and you can look down on the rock slide. And the whole time I was hiking up the ridge, I could hear residual rockfall coming off the pile. So it's unfortunate because it's quite a ways away from the popular climbs that a lot of people have heard of, like Jade or Creature from the Black Lagoon. It is, I think, a half a mile away. Like the lowest part of the landslide would be a half a mile up canyon from popular climbs like Riddles in the Park or Jade or the El Jorge's, that kind of stuff. So, you know, I hope that with an open dialogue, we can kind of create some way that we can extend the boundary up a little higher, so we can at least have access to that. But as of right now, it's just closed indefinitely.
that's a shame. Gosh,
It
that
is.
area is beautiful. I just want to use this as a little side note to emphasize. I had this thing that I learned somewhere along the way from really good climbers, and it was this idea that if you're at a boulder and you think you can do it, get it done. Like have this get it done mentality. And I think when you're younger, especially if it's like a local crag, sometimes you kind of, oh, like I'm close, like I made good progress today, I'll come back tomorrow. It's just like you never know. And we talked on Carlo's pod about this, where I thought Carlo and is a good at executing. He gets it done. And
Yes.
I just think there's some lesson there around like, you never know, it might just fall off a cliff. Like, like literally it might just get closed. And it's just a good reminder, like, boulders are not quite forever. And not only that, sometimes we get older, sometimes we get injured.
Yeah.
Get it done when you're out there, because you never know if it'll be there tomorrow.
I sometimes I feel like I watch different climbers and their approach, and they get close, and some climbers are like, is the door open for me to send? Can I look? I don't know. I'm kind of hesitant. And other climbers are like pushing at the door as hard as they can to force it open to get it done. And I think that's another trait that I've seen in a lot of really good climbers, Carlo included, that when they get close, they execute.
We did a whole podcast on this recently, the performance under pressure. And something that I still struggle with is uh, when you get into those harder problems, or maybe not even harder problems, some of them that are like really sharp or something. It's like when I know I can do it, I'd still say that the amount of tries it takes me can sometimes be too much. And you'll hear this from pros, where they'll say like, I only have 2 tries on this before my tip will split or something. And I would say that it's important to recognize that, when you know you can do something, you should try to take it from like, I know I can do it in the next 10 sessions to 1 session to 1 try. And that's where those people really are getting it done, where they say, I know it's possible. And so right here, right now. And I just love seeing that.
It's interesting. There is a moment when you're projecting, for me, anyways, there's a moment where maybe I've done all the moves, or maybe I've linked, but the light bulb flips on, and it goes from like, I'm not sure to, I know I can do this. And that's the moment when I feel like, I've talked to Dave about this a bit. And the idea that I asked him one time, how hard do you try when you project? Are you trying 100% every time? He's like, absolutely not, which is something that I completely related to, because I don't try 100% when I'm projecting either. He was like about 75%. And I was like, I think that's probably close to what I would say too. So I'm trying about 75% as I'm figuring out the moves, figuring out the body positions, not just destroying my skin, grabbing holds as hard as I possibly can, not tiring myself out, seeing if I can figure out the movement with less than 100%. And then once I've kind of intellectually figured out the climb, now I can sit down and try 100% and really go after it. And I think that conservation throughout the projecting process can, like, if you're trying to do something hard in a day, that is incredibly helpful.
That
That
is,
I'm never gunning all out until I sit down to actually try it.
that's definitely a skill that I feel like you have as a really great climber, that people still probably need to develop a bit. Where I totally agree with you 100%, but I have a hunch that people learn what they're capable of kind of by throwing themselves against the wall, maybe a little too much when they're
Mm-hmm.
younger. And, then they go, okay, now I know what it feels like to know I can do the move without actually doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So that just reminds me of I had talked to Max Zolotukhin briefly before we hopped on here and said, "Hey, do you have any any points for Jamie?"
Love
And
that.
one thing he said is like he wanted to hear about you putting something like 100 days into nothing but sunshine.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, is there? Sounds like there might be a good story behind that.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Michigan and I started climbing when I was 20, 21, and I'm 45 now. So I've been climbing for 26 or 27 years. When I started, I had access. There weren't any gyms really. There was one gym in Michigan. It was an hour and a half away, not really, or hour and 45 minutes away, not really a reasonable distance for me to drive to go on a Tuesday, every Tuesday night. Um, I started climbing at a really small sandstone cliff. It was like 20 feet high, 30 feet high. There wasn't much there. It was all top roping. It's so soft, in fact, that it can't be bolted. So the rock is it's just a, excuse me, kind of a classic uh, Midwestern cliff. And I climbed there for 3 years. And the whole time I was climbing there, all I could think of is get me out of here. And I just want to go to Waco. I just want to go to Colorado. I just want to go anywhere where there is climbing and try harder things, because I had climbed the crag out pretty quickly. And so when as soon as I finished college, I moved to Colorado and I immediately went up to upper lower chaos and just said, what's the hardest problem here? I want to try that. So I'm just going to try nothing but sunshine. At the time it was V14. And I don't care how long it takes. I am just going to try and try and try again until I do it. And yeah, it was probably 35 days a year over 3 years that it took me to climb that boulder problem. And yeah, it was a huge moment in my life. I mean, 2005 V13 was that was all right.
Yeah, yeah. That was a very
I mean,
impressive send back then.
obviously a lot of people are a lot stronger, but for me it was a real, I felt very strongly when I was young that I wanted to dive into something as deeply as possible that was a physical challenge while I had a strong physical body, and push myself to the absolute limit. And that really facilitated that. And it was awesome. You know, I just felt every step is a step closer to doing this boulder. I never really felt frustrated by it. It was just, I just want to keep trying. And I think Carlo kind of touched on this. This kind of almost like false optimism, or kind of optimism that's not hinged with like actually what's happening. Because like any normal person would be like, well, I mean, I've tried this 60 days and I haven't done it. What am I doing? And like looking back on it, it probably wasn't the best strategy, but it also was what I wanted at the time. And yeah, it was an important send for me.
Damn, congrats. That is,
Thanks.
I just love that how you started out by saying, I went to Colorado. I said, take me to the hardest thing. And then
Mhm.
you just dove in. It's funny because I'll say when I was younger, I would have been meaner to that Jamie, where it was like, look, you have no business being here. Stop greasing up these
Yeah.
holds. Like, but as I've gotten older, I just appreciate that like passion and love it. And this is, when I met Tim, my typical co-host, he was, 12
Uh-huh.
or 13. And, you 12 or 13-year-olds are just
Right.
obnoxious, and they do stuff. They throw themselves at some V8 and he should be climbing V2. And now I just, there's almost like I admire that like youthful love, and that optimism, that like infectious optimism of just like I can do anything.
I can do anything. Yeah,
I
it's so
love it.
wild. And so, it's funny because there was an old article in Climb Magazine from Chris Sharma, who I have immense respect for. Chris talked about kind of adopting a beginner's mindset again, and how difficult that was as someone who's experienced. And I see that, as I got older, I could feel myself falling into traps. Like I would try hypnotize minds and I'd be like, I don't know, this feels really hard. I would kind of doubt myself or have skepticism, where the 20-year-old Jamie was just all in, even in the face of total ridiculousness. And I think there's something to be said for that. And like you say, while it can maybe come off as youthful exuberance, maybe there is a little something there that allows that person to achieve something really great.
Man, I definitely love the Sharma story. I got a lot of respect for him once he pushed into realization. There was another good naming controversy, but I just remember seeing him just cruise everything, and it's very different to repeat what's been done in front of you and then go and say, okay, I'm going to be the person who does the first 15A, 15B, because it's not like that. In hindsight, it all looks normal, like, oh, you were the best climber and you progressed the grade. But the reality is that it's very hard to push into the unknown and to have optimism in the face of like reasonable pessimism, right? And one thing I just want to say before I forget about that optimism that kids have is something I like pushing on this podcast, where we talk about greatness, is unreasonable optimism, just like you're talking about walking
Mm-hmm.
up to something that is above you, but then contrasting that with kind of reality, and being able to say like, okay, this is way outside what I can do now, but I can do eventually. But what are the steps that actually takes to get that? And being kind of cold hearted and calculated with yourself and saying, okay, but if I want to do this, I still have to train and maybe do the fingerboard or try 100 days. And I just love, I just wanted to make sure that we aren't just painting that rosy picture of like, just go try anything and you'll make it. It's like, yes, but you put in the work. You showed up
Oh
every
yeah.
day. Yeah.
So yeah, those are great points, and they kind of ignite some ideas in my mind, which are that my I believe very strongly in the human body's ability to adapt. I think that the way that we can actually change our bodies is phenomenal. And I think that by spending more time on a difficult climb like that, we're actually have the ability to alter our body. And that does take a little bit of time to do, but we become so kind of intellectually familiar with the climb, the subtleties, and that only increases the more time we spend on it. And I do think our bodies have the ability to adapt. And oftentimes climbers, even pro climbers, don't delve into that as deeply as they could. I think Nolly did with Burden of Dreams. He really extended, many days on one boulder problem. Oftentimes it's 3 to 5 days, maybe 10 days at the most. But to allow your body to really learn something deeply over 100 days is something that we have the ability to do. And I also think that we live in a world where there's a ton of pressure to, we go climbing every weekend for a lot of people. Did I do anything? Did I send? That's 5 weeks in a row. I didn't do anything. At the time, social media didn't exist, but I also don't think I would have even cared, because I had a deep kind of seated interest in my soul that I wanted to explore. And that didn't relate to what anyone else was doing at all. I just wanted to pursue this idea that I had that I thought was interesting as deeply as I could. And that's hard, I think, today in today's world, where it's just consume, 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 next, 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 next.
Jamie, I sorry to interrupt you. It's just,
Yeah.
so you got this moniker of the sheriff, right? And people
Mm-hmm.
give you shit about just being honest about your opinions. But I think one of the reasons why people give you shit is because they're not willing to take things seriously. Like hearing you talk about this stuff, it's like you're like, you put up your hand, you say, "Hey, I care. I really want to climb my best. I'm all in and I'm trying my best." And because of that, you have carved out conditions of success for yourself. You say, hey, like, this is how I think our sport works. This is what it means to me to climb this problem. This is why I want to climb it. I'm willing to put effort into it. And this is what I think is funny about, people will give others crap that aren't willing to just take something seriously. And, I kind of, one of the questions to ask you is, how do you go from good to great, or how did you make that leap into really climbing super hard? But clearly we've been talking about this for the last half an hour about how you
Yeah.
made that leap. And I just want to both commend you. I think it also kind of showcases why you have opinions is because you're willing to care. And I think that is actually one of the preconditions for doing your best is to look in the mirror and say, oh, actually, I do care. I do care about this.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think you kind of touched on this before, where climbers would push back and say, "Oh, I'm a sole climber. I don't want you care too much." I hear that all the time. You care too much, and that's totally fine. But I also, for me, I want to approach, I mean, for me, climbing is a lot of things, but having the authenticity to just acknowledge straight up that, I'm devoting my whole life to this. I rearranged my relationships. I rearranged where I live. I rearranged how I work and how much money I make so that I can pursue this, and acknowledging like, I do want to do this. I do love this. And I want to throw myself in wholeheartedly and authentically, and just, it it feels like good to my soul to do that. And so I why not just own it? You know, I would see people that they would do the same thing. They're traveling, they're climbing, they make $5,000, $10,000 a year to scrape by so they can go climbing all the time. They look at every single social media thing they can possibly look at, and then they go, dude, what do you care? You care too much. And I'm like, I mean, you do realize that you've done all these things for this thing that you seemingly love, and I totally get that. Like, people are at different places, and maybe they're not ready to acknowledge that, or maybe that makes them feel uncomfortable, and that's fine too. But for me, it was just this authentic, and one thing I want to touch on was an artistic pursuit from
Mm.
basically the very beginning, and that does buck a lot of social trends. And it took me a while to really own that, but it is where I'm coming from 100%.
What do you mean by artistic, actually?
Yeah. So I think that I'm like, we have all these great conversations, and there's so much focus on hangboard and 7 millimeter, 6 millimeter, 4 millimeter. And am I going V14, V15? And certainly that stuff is interesting to talk about. But for my own climbing pursuit, I see myself as an artist who is basically creating their own art through the development of boulders. So creating new boulders, creating new sequences, inventing new sequences on rock that we've never climbed on before. Because it's one thing to go to Bishop and say like, okay, I did the buttermilker and all the beta's been figured out, and I can climb on this rock and I know what it is. But to go to some place that's totally different, has different texture, has different seasons, have different conditions, and you're basically inventing new movement for climbing, because no one has ever been to, maybe Michigan. There's new boulders in Michigan that no one's ever climbed on. Those are new moves and new artistic expressions that no one has ever delved into. And I think in the same way that a good piece of art can feel challenging, I think that a good new boulder problem can feel challenging and can present kind of new ideas about what movement can be. I see a lot of parallels to that. And I love good challenging art, just like I love good challenging boulder problems. I also love the idea of, I see a boulder problem as not just a derivative of, I go to the gym, I climb this sequence of holds. Now I go outside, I climb this sequence of holds. I see it as a complete interaction with myself and the earth, and that feels super important to me. And I don't ever really hear anyone talk about any of this stuff, but for me, that feels like, for me to be in a landscape that's new and wild and different, and basically interacting with that landscape through bouldering, it feels wildly artistic, and it has given my life a tremendous amount of meaning.
I'm one of the probably, maybe it's common in climbing, but I think that rock looks better with chalk on it. When you start kind of like chalking up a rail and you kind of see
Mm-hmm.
the boulder come to life, I think it looks more beautiful. Uh, so here's my, I don't want to say pushback, maybe more just my
Yeah.
exposure to, I love the idea of art in climbing. I think that really like everything we do is somehow like an artistic expression, with the caveat being that typically it's when you do something at a high level. So I'm not a prolific FAer by any stretch of the imaginations. I
Mm-hmm.
am not a developer, not against it. I just, when I look at what I actually do, clearly it's not something that I've prioritized. But where I really connect with what you're saying is that I think that if you look at any top climber, you could, put a hood over their head and you would see how they move, and you would see that they're expressing their unique body, even sometimes over the exact same holds and feet in some beautiful and different way. So it's one of my love of pursuit of mastery or greatness, is that I think that your unique self comes through more and more the better you get, and how you choose to do a move, even if it's kind of the same move everyone else does, you're still expressing your unique abilities and sense in that specific move. So I kind of think of it artistically like that.
I look at someone like Chris Sharma, and he picks like the Dino in Majorca. He picked biography. He picks these really stunningly beautiful pieces of rock to climb, and I see a tremendous artist in that. I also see a tremendous artist in someone like Dave, who takes a very different approach than Chris, but is also kind of allowing that unique self to come out and express themselves on the rock. One thing I wanted to touch on was, I am really interested in this philosopher. I feel like because of the podcast that we both listen to, you probably heard of him. His name is Rene Girard.
Oh yeah.
And Girard says that basically most or all humans have this, what they call mimetic desire, which is kind of the desire to repeat each other, to follow each other. And our desire to follow each other drives a lot of what we do. And there are also these small group of people who are not repeating, who are doing kind of stepping left. And it seems like humanity does really well when we have a bunch of people that are repeating, and then a small number of people who are inventing and tinkering and producing new things. And I've always kind of, and oftentimes he also refers to some of those people as kind of outcasts or scapegoats. And that, maybe that's partially where the sheriff comes from. I don't know. I feel like that's kind of a scapegoated character. I felt that sometimes. But ultimately, what I'm like, that pursuit of, and I think going back to Nothing But Sunshine, the pursuit of an experience where I pushed myself to the limit was completely independent from a grade. I wasn't necessarily trying to climb V14. It was the hardest problem. So I felt like it was a kind of a playground for me to pursue that. It was a nice place for me to pursue that. But I was in search of an experience where I felt like I had pushed beyond what I could ever thought I had done. And in that way, it was very successful.
Yeah. I love how people, I mean, you're kind of the really zoomed out version there is like how you craft your life to put these different experiences into your realm. But, to make it more concrete in the climbing world, this is why I think one's 8A or scorecard, wherever you want to say, is kind of like, it's a resume. Like, I guess my point is that, like, if you look at what my first V10 was, or what my first V11 was, or the climbs that you see populating on mine, I have, to me, it's me showcasing like, this is the type of climber I am. This is like, I go after these climbs, versus, I try to avoid what I deem 1-star climbs. And it's interesting that you talk about that Girard and mimetic theory. So I have a degree in philosophy. So I love,
okay. Awesome.
But I always used to think about this, and I think climbers will really resonate with this, where, you go to school, you get good grades because you have a test in front of you. And like, it's like, how do you pass a test? Well, it's like you get, 100% on it, mm-hmm. and they give you the test. And then you go to college, you get a job. And I worked in the corporate world. And I always called that following the yellow brick road. It's like laid out in front of you, and success is clearly defined. And it's, to me, the people that I've always looked up to, I think that's pretty much universal though, is the ones who give themselves the test instead of getting the test given to them. And I love Sharma is one of my heroes because again, he just repeated everything. And that's like, okay, what's his test now? And, even though I know Nothing But Sunshine was an established boulder, like, to me, it's cool that what you said was like, no one told you like, this is what you should climb, Jamie. It was, I'm going to set myself up what I believe is the hardest test in front of me right now. And I'm going to put myself forward to it. There's just something aesthetic and artistic about what challenge do you give yourself? And there's no right or wrong answer there, right? Like if you had said like, I want to win the Olympics, well, it's like, that's very different from finding the next, midnight lightning and climbing it in a cool new area, but it's about like giving yourself the test versus just having it handed down to you that I think everyone finds inspiring.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how many times I've told people, "Hey, I'm in a new area. It's really cool." I'm not necessarily one to like write and hand out a bunch of directions for everyone, but if people ask me about it, and I would say, "Hey, I'm at this place and I really like it. It's fun." I don't know that it's Fontainebleau, but it's or something. But it's good bouldering, and no one will go. No one will go. 5 years go by, no one will go, and then the guidebook comes out, and then everyone goes.
So,
And yeah,
sorry. So Max's one of Max's questions, Zolatukin, was, "What area will blow up in the next 10 years?"
uh,
Maybe we shouldn't say it. But
we'll have to find out in 10 years.
yeah, yeah. But is there anything that you think is? I'll leave that up to you. However you want to answer, or if you don't want to answer it.
I think that there are a number of places that people are going to hear about in the West. I would say Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, that are going to become, excuse me, nationally notarized areas that people will go to that no one is going to right now.
Okay, I'll get I'll ask you to drop pins off air, but although
I would let me say this.
yeah.
I'll give you this tidbit. I think there are two areas. I think that in 10 years, Joe's Valley could be the third best bouldering area in Utah.
Whoa. Okay, that took me a moment to unpack because I was like, Joe's Valley is incredible, and he says the third. Joe's Valley really is incredible, by the way, too.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've had a
Interesting.
lot of great memories. I love it. It's one of the best. It's awesome.
So one side of this stuff is that I'm actually I'm kind of a advocate for not keeping things under the hat in the sense that we were all beginner climbers and someone took me under their wing and took me to Bishop when there was no
Mhm.
guidebook. So I'm always like, I have this like dual side because when I go to now that I have wife and kids and I'm really busy, I'm one of those people who goes to Bishop the weekend after Thanksgiving, and it's just a fucking shit show. And I curse very specifically for that. And I'll never forget going to the ice caves, which I don't know why I was even in there. It's like this place in Sad Boulders, and it's kind of there's I don't even know if it's an easy 10. There's a common 10 for people to do their first time. It's called Beefcake. I
Uh-huh.
walked in there. There's music playing. There's people smoking weed, and there's a dog in there. And I have nothing against any of those things I just listed. I was just like, what am I doing in here? I gotta get out, because it really is kind of special to run around an area where there's not many people, or if someone is there, you know them, they're respectful. Yeah, no one's blasting reggae. And so it's like weird because I encourage you to, you're doing this work of developing and creating something that I'm sure you want to share, but then there's a downside to letting that out there too.
So yeah, that's interesting. So I don't necessarily feel the impulse to share. I think I did when I was younger. At this point, I don't. It's not that I'm necessarily protecting it. It's that I just don't. I just feel like I'm doing the thing that I want to do, and I've worked really hard to find a lot of these places, and so. It's not my responsibility to go and tell everyone because I'm putting in the hard work that if you ask me and we become friends and we get to talk, I'd be happy to take people out there. I also want to touch on the point that, I went to Chaos Canyon in 2001, still a pretty new area. I think Dave had just started cleaning Jade in 2001. He just started trying it as a project. So people were just starting to push into upper chaos. And I thought, boy, this is amazing. What an incredible place to go bouldering. And I thought, wow, I'm so fortunate to be here at this new moment when all these new boulders are going up and every day there's a new V12 and a V10 and, oh, this thing is so sick. And you never walked around this corner and you saw this. And I thought that experience when I was younger was really specific to Chaos Canyon alone. That was Chaos Canyon that provided that. And then what I realized after running around was that you can have that experience through basically an infinite number of mediums, rock type, landscapes, etc. It's always there if you're willing to step left when everyone else steps right. And that to me has just been a tremendous motivation, that like I'm kind of seeking that same experience of walking into, oh my gosh, what is the potential? What can we find? How can we paint up these new boulders? All that stuff I found was available in a lot of different places, just by putting in the work, and I've been able to find it, and it's awesome.
What's it like writing a guidebook, or what's the hardest part of writing a guidebook?
The hardest part of the guidebook is, I told you, Josh, I really appreciated your professionalism, and I still do. And I think that dealing with climbers, trying to gather information, essays, is near impossible. I will ask someone for something, and it will be 6 months later. I tell this story all the time with Dave. It's a good story. I said, Dave, I want you to write a huge essay for the park guidebook. I would love to hear your stories, your experience. I would love that to be kind of the centerpiece. I actually want it to be like in the center of the book, a centerpiece for the Rocky Mountain National Park Bouldering Guide, because you kind of have done more for that place than anyone. You really created it an area as a 17-year-old, a gigantic accomplishment. And at the time I lived next door to him. So it wasn't like he was, off in Maine, or, we were neighbors. I would see him every day, and every day I would be like, the essay, how's that come? Oh yeah, I'll get it to you. Don't worry. 3 weeks later, hey Dave, that essay. Oh yeah, I'm still working on it, and it went on for like this for 8 months. And it became clear to me that I wasn't going to get an essay. And so I said, hey Dave, let's just go climbing like we do. And I'll just give you a bunch of interview questions. I'll record it, and then I'll transcribe it. And that's ended with that. He was like, oh yeah, that's good. We'll do that. And so that ended up being his essay in the guidebook, which is just, I think, speaks to the difficulty it is of kind of wrangling climbers to, at work, I ask someone for something, and it's on my desk in 20 minutes or an hour, it's right there. And with climbers, it's like a ridiculous process.
Yeah. I've had similar experiences. I remember a friend of mine was clearly good enough to get sponsored, wanted to be sponsored by a specific company. And I said, just write an email, just, reach out to them. Like you're doing great. And I ended up writing the email for them, and they got sponsored. And it took me, like 3 minutes. I just said let's just sit down and do it. There is probably some professionalism coming into climbing, for better or for worse. Really quick, which guidebooks have you authored?
So I wrote the first edition and the first edition was the bouldering guide to Mount Evans and Rocky Mountain National Park. So it encompassed both Mount Evans and Rocky Mountain National Park, kind of a front range alpine bouldering guidebook. And then the second book I wrote was the boulder. There were so many new problems that we were able to split it into 2 books. So the second book, which came out in October, is the bouldering guide to Mount Evans. And that includes Mount Evans, Lincoln Lake. Like Mount Evans traditionally is like area A, area B, and then Lincoln Lake, and then Guanella Pass, which is also in the Mount Evans wilderness area. So that's I actually prefer smaller guidebooks, because I don't like lugging around a 500-page book that has, 425 pages I don't need for that day. So this is a little bit of a smaller book. And then the third book, which just came out as pre-order, is for Rocky Mountain National Park.
Very cool.
Wild Basin, Upper Chaos, Lower Chaos, those areas.
Upper Chaos, rest in peace.
Yes.
Something you kind of passed over, but I just thought it would be fun to share again, is you talked about like different landscapes, different rock types, and, developing these different areas. And I'm not even sure if there's a question here, more just an emphasis that I've been lucky enough to travel a decent amount to climb. Mm-hmm. And something that just really strikes me is the different vibe of each area. Vibe is, just a really amorphous word, but I'll never forget one day or one climbing trip where I just climbed in Red Rocks and Joe's Valley. And this was pretty early on for Joe's Valley. I don't even know if there was really a guidebook. But I just remember waking up, climbing in craft boulders, and it was hot and deserty and red. And then we drove and woke up in Joe's Valley the next day, and it was a little more foreboding and canyony, and the rock was different. And it's just something that I think sometimes people, maybe they haven't really had the luxury of traveling. And I just encourage people to go to as many different areas and just experience, like when you say Lincoln Lake, when I think of Lincoln Lake, I just will never forget kind of parking and like looking down at that steep descent and that beautiful lake. And it's just, we talked about this before. Sometimes I make fun of Colorado for the aesthetics of the lines. Like I guess because I was kind of raised on or cut my teeth on Bishop and Yosemite and these like tall,
Yeah.
picturesque lines, but Colorado has the what's the called the position or there's a better name for just the feeling of that landscape in spades and I don't know where I was going there. Just go to different places. They're all really cool and they have different vibes and I love that.
I think that is really something that climbing offers that a lot of basically no other sport offers, which is being able to interact. I mean, it kind of encourages you to travel, right? Like, oh, hey, I want to go to Leavenworth. I want to go to Boone. I want to go to the Gunks. I want to go to all these landscapes, all these different rock types, all these different places. And, as someone, I mean, I deeply, I feel like I have a deep love and relationship with nature in general. So I just love being outside. I love experiencing the way the sun rises and the way the sun hits the mountains, or that's different in Bishop than it is in Leavenworth, let's say, or different than it is in Indian Creek. And all that's kind of offered up for you for free in a lot of cases, which is pretty amazing. And I think that's really an amazing way that will ultimately lead to a lifelong, allow climbing to be a real lifelong pursuit for people, which I think is just great. So yeah, I love to travel. I've traveled all over the world, and I love to experience. How do the birds sound in Australia? Well, they're pretty crazy if you've been there. How do the birds sound in the desert? It may just be one little bird chirping in the morning. All those little subtleties are just beautiful reasons to enjoy and experience climbing.
I love our sport. And I know I think we have a lot of kind of indoor focused climbers on this podcast because Tim is
Mm-hmm.
also well known as a World Cup competitor, and I, as someone who grew up in the gym, I was probably the first generation of gym rats. I have lots of love for the gym as well, but I would encourage people to embrace that fact of our sport where it takes you to places that you just would never go. Like I remember going to Rocklands and you're like, okay, you fly
Yeah,
into Cape Town, which is beautiful. But instead of just
right.
getting your picture taken on Lion's Head, I think that's what it's called, which I did.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're like, okay, like let's drive 3 hours out in the middle of nowhere. And it's just gorgeous. And I'm guessing I would say surfing maybe could do something like that, skiing. But we're all rock grippers. So that's what I gravitated towards.
Yeah. So why would I ever, I mean, maybe I would, but in general, why would I go to end up in South Africa? But there I was, and in that garden of just
Mhm.
beauty and animals and wildlife. It's so amazing. And just the ability to go there and experience climbing in that kind of landscape is incredible.
Switching gears just a little
Mhm.
bit, we talked about Dave Graham off and on throughout this podcast, and touched on Nale, who I know you've climbed with a bit. I would love
Mhm.
to dive a little deeper into just your experiences of being around these amazing climbers. And we discussed this before. I think we both have this admiration of the uniqueness that is Dave Graham and how he climbs. I think there's a lot to learn from him. Uh, and I don't know how to start this section, but maybe is there any thread that you felt like you could see between some of these great climbers that you spent time with, whether it was Daniel Woods, Dave Graham, Nale? I mean, really, man, those are some of the best climbers that have ever lived.
Yeah. I think there is a real elevated um, take on just about everything. So when I listen to the way that Dave talks about climbing, it is in super complicated ways that I certainly had never thought of. I used to root set, and I root set quite a bit. I set some World Cups and ABS Nationals for a number of years, and so I have experience as a developer as well. I have experience of like thinking about new beta, new ways to do things, thinking outside the box. I used to get a lot of crap from people for breaking the beta all the time. So I really like the idea of inventing beta, new beta, and Dave is better than just about anyone at doing that. And so I would go to boulders with him and be like, I'm going to think of all the solutions, all the possible solutions to this problem, and I will basically try to outsmart Dave. Just sitting here watching him climb, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to come up with all the possible things he could do. And it was like, I mean, maybe I don't know how many times he did this, but there were a number of times where I would just be, he would just, it was almost as if he could read my mind, see all the solutions I had come up with, and then he would do the one that I hadn't thought of. And he was like, there it is. That's the only way to do it. That's it. And so that kind of thinking for, that is a really accelerated and advanced way to think about climbing that I think separates people like Dave and Nale. Their willingness to push into unknown and uncharted waters. Certainly those guys repeated stuff, but Nale said at some point, I'm going to go to Finland where no one really goes bouldering. And I found this boulder problem and I'm going to sit here and work on it for a long time until I do it. And so that is, he's not, he may not do it. He tried that Sisu project for number, and he said it was, was nearly impossible. V7, V18 or V20 or something. I mean, the willingness to step outside the conventions is, I think, strikes me through all of those guys, that they're not just in terms of going to try a first ascent where no one has gone, but also just in the way they think about beta, the way they think about different ideas, the way they think about everything is really unconventional. And that always strikes me as how unconventional it is compared to kind of the masses that are going to Red Rocks doing, just kind of having a climbing trip, repeat climbing standard boulders.
Just me. Kind of yeah. Just guys like
which
me.
is fine. Like I don't mean to, I hope that doesn't come off as me being critical of that, because I've certainly, I went to Rocklands just to, and I looked for first ascents for sure, but I also just wanted to climb Ulaanbaatar. It's like one of the most famous V7 or V8 boulder problems in the world. And I climbed it and it was great. I had a blast. So I do appreciate that. And I understand that. But when I think about those guys, they are really outside the box.
Oh, and dude, that's what we're here for, right? Is what is it that makes those guys tick? Or what are they doing differently? And something that I just kind of want to explore a little bit when it comes to Dave is, so there's this trope almost like that he's quote unquote weak. And I kind of want to push back against that, because this metric of maybe how many one-arm pull-ups Dave can do, if he can even do any, something that I wonder about is, as we look at people doing things outside of the box, and Dave is famous for that, is he actually weak, or is he just strong in his own ways and he's really embraced that? And so when he looks at a boulder and unlocks this new beta, it's almost obvious to him. And it makes me think of the easier example, actually, kind of in his time, Chris Sharma. I often talk about how he was one of the first guys to really dyno, it seemed like, to really embrace a dynamic style. And I remember this part from some dosage, or I don't know, whatever, some great, when he was in Switzerland, I want to say. And there was some quote about how, like, you can't skip these holds, or you're just going to go from one good hold to the next good hold. Mm-hmm. And they said, you can't do that on this one. And then he did. And it's sometimes it's easier to see that and understand that, where you see a guy just go from one good hold to the next good hold, but that was him embracing his strength. And I want to pick at, like, is Dave Graham weak, or is he incredibly strong? It's just in a way that we don't quite, it's a little harder to tease out than, like, wow, look at your biceps or something like that.
I think yes, he is incredibly strong. And I think that we think conventionally Chris Sharma seems stronger because he had the flowing locks and he's all tan and he's got big muscles. But I think there's a lot of ways to be strong. And I think that Dave explores this way of being strong, because he just put up a new V16. I mean, he's really been at the cutting edge of climbing for a long time. And it's not just repeating boulders, it's putting up new ones. And it's really amazing. I think Dave is not conventionally strong in the way that Chris Sharma is strong. But I think, like I said, there's a spectrum of how we can view strength. Dave's hand strength is like off the chart. I mean, it's crazy how strong his hands are. One of the first times I ever climbed with him, we went to Upper Chaos, and I saw him flash a V11, and it was like he was climbing V4. I mean, it was a little crimpy sequence, and it was like the holds were 3 times as big as they felt. I was like, well, those were full pad crimps. I could do the same thing. So he is incredibly strong. He also is incredibly efficient. So he gets a lot out of, and by that I just mean he's an amazing technical climber. So what's the kind of conventional strength that he does have, he maximizes that to an ability of, I don't know that I know another climber that's maximized their strength as much as Dave. And there's such a focus on training and hangboarding and strength and pull-ups and, moon boards and tension boards and kilter boards and all these kind of physical tests. And I think, what if every climber got as much out of their technique as Dave did? Like Dave is, he has incredibly strong hands, and he does have the ability to lock off really strongly. He struggles to do a one-arm pull-up. I think he's done maybe one time, but for a long time he couldn't do one. But he maximizes that strength too through his incredible efficiency. And I just see there's so much emphasis on training and getting stronger when there could be a lot of emphasis on being a better climber. And that would it's a much easier way to improve your ability than, maximizing finger strength. I don't think that's bad to do that, but I just think I see someone like Dave who is so intelligent and has so maximized that he benefits tremendously from it.
Yeah, I'm actually definitely one of those people who was probably stronger, and I didn't really lean into like the training stuff, but I don't know. I appreciate like the vulgar display of power, that Sharma would have. Although I think it's funny because I think people can look at Sharma. I remember friends critiquing Sharma and saying, "Look, he doesn't keep his feet on, and he's not that great technically." And I would actually argue that he's found the technique that really works for him. But I wanted to dive into something you mentioned earlier, not on this call, but beforehand, this idea behind technique versus smoothness, or, we just talked about like Dave Graham's efficiency and technique, and, what's the subtlety there behind, technique, someone who looks like they're climbing well and someone who is climbing well?
Yeah, that's a great thing. And that was something that came to me through route setting. But I kind of came to this conclusion that some people are smooth, some people have good technique, and some people are smooth and have good technique, and that they're actually two different things. And while people who have good technique can be smooth, it's not a prerequisite for it. It doesn't necessarily, like Dave, I've seen look pretty herky jerky sometimes, but still while using what I would consider extremely good technique. And I've also seen people who I think suffer from their smoothness. They're so concerned about controlling the movement and appearing like they're in control and being smooth, that, to your point about Chris Sharma, that was kind of the paradigm in the late 80s, was people were trying to be as smooth and controlled as possible. And Chris came along and said, it's actually more efficient to jump, because I can have strong hands and I can just jump between the holds. I don't need to do a lock off. And so it made me realize that there were people who are really smooth, and those smooth climbers can have good technique, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they do have good technique. And there are climbers who have good technique, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're smooth. I don't think that Chris is the smoothest climber, and I don't think that Dave is the smoothest climber either. Certainly they look pretty good when they climb generally, but I don't think they're the smoothest climbers. But I think Dave, for example, has some of the best technique.
Yeah, Jimmy may be an example of someone who is both smooth and has great technique. But when you talk about that smoothness and sometimes people suffering from it, it actually kind of reminded me of some of the mistakes I've made where I will overpower something, especially when it's kind of maybe a little easier to really make it seem like I'm in control, and it just does you no favors. Although I will say that the one thing around that is when I look at video of some of my hardest sends, it's actually really smooth and looks easy. And it's funny how when you're climbing at your best, it often does exhibit beautiful, smooth technique and makes it look easy. But I like you flagging that difference between looking good and doing the thing. You know, it's there's some song I wrote I wrote a freaking philosophy paper on this one time. It's
Uh-huh.
uh it's not what you look like when you're doing what you're doing. It's what you're doing when you look like you're doing. And so don't even
Yeah.
that's express yourself. There's an Easy E song, but that's the original. But the point is just don't get caught up in looking like you're good, right? Don't look like you're climbing well. Climb well, and
Right.
focus on it's where you put your focus. And I just think that's a good reminder. And also maybe don't get so sucked in when you see someone doing something and you like how it looks because it's you're not them. You don't know that that may not work for you. It's about doing it the best way. Technique is
You know,
not exactly quantitative in that sense.
yeah, I think there isn't, there could be an argument made for if someone wants to, approach a climb with their own unique style and they're not so concerned about an achievement that they want to just climb it in a certain way and they want to do it smoothly. Yeah, that's super interesting and awesome. But I think there is this point of separating the idea that just because someone looks smooth doesn't necessarily mean that they have good technique. And yeah, Dave is a great example because he's not the smoothest climber, but he gets it done like almost no one else. And I think it really speaks volumes
Is
to
he
his
the
ability.
shaky warrior? Is that does that ring a bell? I feel like for some reason that popped into my head. Is that
I don't know if I would necessarily call him the shaky warrior. I think I have a ton of respect for Dave. He's awesome, and just the way he's pushed climbing forward, like you say, the cool boulder problem names. I think he's the best at that. He's super linguistic, but I think he
well
does.
read? Definitely, a lot of those
Yes,
books are great. That he, yeah, I think people sometimes don't realize those names come from books often, which are great books too.
yeah. Philip K. Dick books is he's a big fan of that. But I just think that like there's a video of Giuliano Cameroni climbing. I think it's a V16. I don't remember which one it is. It's a hard boulder problem, but he gets to the top and he's just like beached whale, kind of flailing. It doesn't look like it's super hard, but he gets it done. And I think that sometimes he kind of threw the technique out the door in the moment to get it done. And I think there's some, what do we think about that? Well, you know, is it important to do it in good style or is it important to get it done? And I think, for a lot of people, they want to get it done. And he was willing to just kind of make himself look a little silly, but he got the climb done. And I think I would also say as a thread between really good climbers, I've seen that as well, that like, I'll just do what I need to do to get it done. And if it's not perfect, that's okay too. I don't have to have it totally dialed in. Every hold is executed perfectly. I got the hold good enough and I'm just going to go and fire it kind of thing.
I've given that advice sometimes when I'm coaching my friends, or I shouldn't say coaching, when we're sessioning and maybe someone is, what am I doing wrong here? I'm like, you gotta try harder. You gotta like let you're grabbing that pinch, your feet are cutting. It's not gonna be pretty. Just try, just make it happen. Like there's no, toe hook that's going to save you. Like you're gonna have to cut, just make it work.
If you're climbing really hard for you, it's going to feel like you're going to fall. And you're probably going to surprise yourself like, I can't believe I stuck that hold. I just was in total desperation and threw out, and somehow I managed to stick it. But it should feel like you're going to fall, really, if you're pushing yourself.
Before we move on from Dave, one thing, and all the great climbers, but Dave is just the one of the better examples of it. One thing that you said to me that I kind of wanted to make sure we highlight for just a moment is this idea that the out of the box thinking that Dave employs and the creativity that he employs can be learned. And
Yeah.
yeah, we didn't go into setting at least yet, and you have an incredible setting resume, and there's setting, there's developing, and there's guys like Dave. And how do you think about developing that creativity or outside of the box thinking? Like, do you have any, practical tips or things that you picked up along the way that can help people embrace that?
Yeah. I would say that when we think about like, what did I say about those guys that they think outside the box? Well, how do you think outside the box? You have to have an open mind that it could be a lot of different solutions. There could be, I would see Dave and he would figure out 6 different solutions to do the climb, and then he could pick the most efficient one. And so, you see a lot of younger climbers, especially, they see a beta on video online, or they see something online, and they're like, that's the beta. But like I said, Dave would come up with crazy beta for things that I was like, this is not at all, even though it doesn't even almost feel like the same boulder problem. It's so different. And that comes through having an incredibly open mind to all the different possibilities. And there's nothing that's really preventing anyone from looking at a climb and trying to come up with, what are the different ways what are the different possibilities? How many different sequences could I generate from this one climb, from this run set of holds? It's a nice exercise to think about. Like, maybe you're going to spot your partner on a boulder and you just are taking a rest day. Sit there and think about, what are all the different ways that someone could actually possibly do this? What about someone who is 5'1"? How would they climb this? What are all the different possible sequences that they could use? Well, they could go left hand first. They could go right hand this. They could go right hand first. They go left. I think there's that developing of your brain. I mean, I know as boulders, certainly we're all find ourselves sitting around watching someone else climb at some point, right? And if you want to hang out and joke around with your friends, that's great. But I think as a nice exercise, walk through as many different, wildly different beta possibilities as you can, and practice that muscle of coming up with different solutions, because sometimes the really inobvious solution is actually fit you a little bit better. And I think it's just a great exercise. And, I think I developed that through my route setting experience and my development experience. Because when you come up to a new boulder, you have no idea how it's going to look. You haven't seen any beta videos. You haven't seen any photos. You don't know anything. And so having the ability to walk through 15 different possible sequences on a climb is incredibly valuable. And it's not just for that one climb. It's for, now you can take that tool and go to every climb you go to. You can, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. X, Y, Z, A, B, C, E, F, G. There's a million different sequences. And I think that is really helpful for being more efficient when you climb.
That's really cool. I love that, that actual actionable, like, try to actually come up with different ways to solve it. And one thing that, I don't know if it helped me, but I was really slapped in the face by this when I started doing more sport climbing, and I had to just, figure it out. There's a lot of moves there, and it really blew me away. I started doing more with Ethan, and how quickly he could find the sequence that he was going to use. And just that ability to look at a rock and then, figure out a couple options and then settle on one quickly is a skill. It makes me think of something me and Tim have talked about, where there's this like dual-sided process. There's using your brain to look at a boulder and deconstruct it and then put it back together in 50 different ways that may work. And then there's also getting on something and trusting your kind of kinesthetic intuition and, hunting for a toe hook. And I want to use this talk to kind of segue into your setting experience in your world and the World Cups then and now. And it's something that I really appreciate about comp climbing is I see the best comp climbers on well set problems just experiment. Just you see like their intuition just hit, and they're just like, I call it hunting for stability. Sometimes they're just like, is it a side pull? Is it an undercling? Is it a toe hook? Is it a heel hook? And you watch them go bam, 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 like 6 different options through their head. And you can comment on that, but I also want to use that to jump into kind of, the setting that you did in the past. So you can tell us your resume, as well as kind of how you've seen it evolve and what you think of kind of the new era of comp climbing.
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the testing, right, they're kind of testing, they're testing their different options in the same ways that companies, if you're an app, you might test 8 different versions of the app and see which one gets the most interest. I think they're doing the same thing. They're testing all these options. In a competition, you have to be really good to do that on the fly. And that's some of the reason why they're the best climbers, because they're like, I know all these possible solutions, and I'm just going to systematically 1, 2, 3, 4, side pull, undercling, side pull with the foot out, foot higher, foot lower. Okay, there it is. Go. They're so good that they can do that on the fly. But to my kind of previous point about beta testing is that you can do that while you're, so many people, they sit down and they're just kind of like, I'm tired. I got to shake out my pump, or I got to rest my fingers, sand my skin, always looking at the skin. I think there can be a real missed opportunity for sitting down and intellectually analyzing and doing that testing to figure out exactly what is the best sequence. And, I've gotten to the point where I could create beta that I hadn't even tried before and then test that beta. Like I would invent new beta just sitting there, and then I could go and test that beta. And I think that process is just super helpful for, the more you practice it, it is something you can practice and learn. And the more open-minded you are to come up with, instead of 3 different solutions, 15 different solutions, the more options you have. And you just see those World Cup climbers are doing that exact thing. They're so good, they can do it in real time, and they can do it in the midst of a competition.
One little interjection on that just hit me is I really enjoy doing spray wall climbing with climbers who are, the same grade or maybe a little better than me, and with different styles. And they help open up my field of vision of what's possible and things I would never, like, this isn't exactly different beta, but it's like almost like the step before where, they say, okay, like with this handhold and this foot, then we can reach all the way to this little crimp. And I would think, no way. Like I would maybe jump to that jug next to it, but I would never do the crimp. But then you see them do it. Now maybe you can, it works you into that frame of reference of, no, that is a possible move. And then that builds in this kind of intuition of what's possible and lets you see a boulder and kind of think like, actually, maybe that little crimp out there that's not chalked is usable for me. And I think that's important.
I can't tell you how many times I've gone to an established boulder problem where there was kind of established beta, and it wasn't necessarily a total break of the beta, but I found myself chalking up holds that people hadn't used, and really helped me in trying to fit my own body. And that, again, that's kind of that outside the box thinking that, like, I don't necessarily have to put my hands on the white spots when I climb up. There may be other options that it's happened enough to me that I completely look for new sequences when I don't ever think that the sequence that I've seen in videos or the sequence that has kind of been told to me by someone else is the sequence. That's another option. And I'll put that in my cache as a beta option. And then I'll take the videos and I'll put those in there, and then I'll see if I can come up with anything new. So
I still get sucked into it, man. I can't tell you how many times I've blown a flash because someone told me this is the beta and it just doesn't feel right, doesn't look right. And we're talking about this and it kind of sounds easy on the surface, but it's those decisions that you make both before getting on the climb and, listening to your instincts on the climb. And I think what I'm really interested in is these tools that you can employ kind of off the wall to then build your intuition on the wall. Cause it's something me and Tim talk about often where, Tim's a coach and, what you're talking about is basically like coaching and learning, but there's this thing that happens where you're on the wall and you're by yourself and, it's how do you put it into play? And I love these kind of ways to build up that intuition deep inside you and these practices that, you started employing from, being around guys like Dave Graham that help inform how you tackle problems.
Yeah, for sure. I think and also my route setting experience I think has a lot to do with that, because when you route set, I would set I set 11 ABS nationals. I set ABS nationals for 8 years. That was kind of
that's a lot
national competition. Yeah. That's a lot. Yeah. And I was part of a 4-person team. It's like, these are the 4 route setters that are going to set the comp. I was head setter 1 year, and often I was kind of given the opportunity to set the hardest problem. So typically men's 4, which would decide the comp, would be my responsibility. And you learn so much by putting those holes on the wall, climbing on the boulder yourself, and then watching what people do on them. And we would always try to, we were trying to figure out how are they going to break this? What are they going to do? They're smart. I assume they're smart, not only a smarter climber than I am. So what's he going to do to try to I'm going to think of 10 options. He's going to think of 15. So what are those 5 options that I'm not thinking of? And just kind of walking through that process of coming up with different beta and being open-minded to like, they might try anything.
Well, and when you deal with amazing climbers, they start being able to break beta in ways that are hard for you to imagine because that slopey pinch you think is really not so good. Maybe Jimmy or Daniel can just, they're like, this jug? What were you talking about? Oh,
Yeah.
I can just
Yeah.
do a 1-arm pull-up and rose move through this. You think, wow. Like, so it's cool to, yeah, expand your horizons by that sense. So those ABS Nationals, that was a different era, and the type of holds, the way the climbers were tested was different. And I guess I just love to hear, because you are open minded and you've kind of stayed current the whole time, and there's developing too, which helps you stay at the cutting edge. What do you think about comp climbing now? Where do you think it's going? I'm not looking for a negative or positive critique, just like when you flip on YouTube and you see, IFSC World Cup and see what they're doing now, what does that evoke from you as a setter and an athlete?
Yeah, the climbing competition scene has changed dramatically in the last 15 years. And when I was really setting the most, there was a big emphasis on power. I was setting power problems to separate Chris Sharma and Daniel Woods and Nale. And now we see what I think people call kind of risky moves or risk moves, where there's a lot of volumes, a lot of kind of balance things, a lot of things that are kind of maybe puzzling a little bit. Like there's a real puzzle that maybe someone can fall the first time, fall the second time, and figure out and do the third time. Whereas a power problem, if you don't do it the first time, there's diminishing returns, right? And I think it is really cool that we have expanded into, because I got another story to tell. So I set an ABS Nationals in Sacramento, 2004, I believe it was, and I was going to set men's number 3 out of 4 problems. So it was the third hardest problem, and I asked them if they had a boss. And the guy was like, yeah, we've got one. And so like the old pusher hold. And
shout out to
I
Jared Roth.
brought it out. Yeah. Shout out to Jared Roth. Absolutely. And so I set the hold on the ground and put a tape box around it. And I think the owner of the gym, or the manager of the gym, about lost it, was just like, what are you doing? This is outrageous. You put a hold on this beautiful boss hold. You just put it on the ground, and climbers are I was like, yeah, they're going to step on the boss and they're going to jump off the boss onto the wall. And he was really upset with me for doing that, or even suggesting that could be a possibility. So I think it's cool to see, this kind of new style of climbing. And just the way that they're really pushing, you see crack boulders, and I think that's great. I think they should expand as much as they can. I do simultaneously think that, I always, when I was setting, there was climbing was starting to blow up, and we were starting to see the first World Cups in the United States. And there was a push to sell route setting. And what I mean by that is we're selling the routes. The climbers are doing crazy things. They're doing a big dyno. They're doing a 1-arm pull-up. They're doing a huge rose move. We're selling that movement to an audience that can understand that they watch someone crimp their way up a V12. That doesn't look very exciting. But if they do a gigantic rose move, boy, that gets people on their feet. And so I always pushed back on the idea that we needed to really change climbing a lot, because I felt that climbing was cool in and of itself, and that we should just allow it to be cool, and we shouldn't be selling it. We shouldn't be selling rose moves to Subaru so they can make money off it. I always just loved climbing in and of itself. And I'm like, we should just set a competition that allows Chris Sharma and Daniel Woods to show why they're so powerful, or Alex Puccio or Brooke Rabitu, or all these competitors, why they're so amazing. And I think they do a better job of balancing that between showing off the competitors. because I think when you look at a sport like skateboarding, it's like, let's put Tony Hawk on the ramp and let him do a 900 and just let him go off. And that's all I ever felt like a route setter is I want to see these competitors just go off. And there is a thing that I know that Daniel Woods can do amorphously that makes him so amazing. So let's give him the opportunity to do that thing. And sometimes I think with, he's going to struggle in these World Cups. And I think there's a space. I think there's a space being created right now for people like Daniel to compete in a power climbing competition and kind of bring that back and allow them just to be climbers. Like everyone climbs in the gym,
Yeah, I think you've listened to that Carlo podcast, and some of that TBF, the Boulder Field Masters kind of comp thing they're doing, which, and Carlo, incredible competitor. I really like seeing Carlo push that forward because he's done a lot of setting. Maybe I'm not sure if he's ever done a lot of like ABS or sanctioned comp setting, but he knows how to set. Damn, does he know how to compete? And he seems to bridge this gap of kind of I don't want to say old school and new school, but I think he has appreciation for all sorts of climbing. And that discussion we had with him around competition got me excited just because it's like, maybe we could do this differently. And when you talk about some of the things that Daniel can do that maybe does not get showcased if you put him on, the qualifier slab boulder. I'll never forget the last nationals I competed at. I don't remember the year off the top of my head, but it was either 2015 or 2016. And it ended with him doing men's number 4, sealing the victory. And it was like this power pinch problem. And it just, made me just love watching him do what Daniel does, where he is world-class in some specific type of movements, a lot of type of movements, and showcasing that and the crowd just on their feet. So I love what you're saying, where climbing is cool. Let's let climbers be who they are. And I understand, I don't know, I can really make an argument for all sorts of every different angle that, competition is headed in, but it's just fun to hear your perspective on that.
I think I mean no disrespect whatsoever to that. We've seen a lot of really good American competitors lately, and they really excel at these kind of athletic boulders. I think that's awesome, but I also think there's space to watch. I would love to watch Drew Ruana, Jimmy Webb, Daniel Woods just throw down on some real hard, powerful boulders and just see what happens. I think that'd be great. And it's just fascinating to me that there are these people who train in the gym, places like Cats or wherever, and they've developed this incredible skill, and there's really no place besides going outside to allow them to showcase that. And I think there's space for it. And I think it'd be awesome if we could get that going.
Yeah. +1 to that. Just before we should start wrapping it up. But I just want to just really quickly touch on World Cup type or comp climbing and the grading around that. And, we had this really interesting discussion around defining a boulder problem. Actually, those boulder problems are very clearly defined. Right. How do we think about grading in that context? Do you think that grades can be applied, like how we grade outdoor climbs can be easily applied there? There's that whole risk scale, which we don't need to define. I would assume our listeners understand that. But yeah, like how do we think about grading with comp climbs? Because that's a really common question I'm sure you got was, hey, Jamie, how hard was men's number 4? Yeah.
I mean, people would ask all the time, and I would say it's as hard as, I would basically defer and never assign a V grade. I think that's almost impossible, especially given the style of these new problems. It would be almost impossible to say and I think oftentimes the climbs are probably easier than people think they are, although they're very hard. There has to be something that someone can do in a a small time frame. And so, I don't know that there's anyone in the world that can walk up to 4 V12s that and can just do them flash, 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 flash. Like that would be really ridiculous.
After doing qualifiers and semis and flying there. Although I bet you that men's number thing. Yeah, that men's number 4, because I grilled Max Zoltuk and was on that team setting that year, and he put out about V12, if anyone was curious. Hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully I'm right
And
there.
then, maybe certainly it's people have, I do believe that climbers have gotten stronger. But I think that, yeah, the idea that you're tired, you're under pressure to climb, you've just climbed back to back to back. Like, yeah, people could do four V12s in a day for sure, but can they do them in a confined, a timed sequence in front of a crowd? That would be hard. And I was always surprised at how relatively easy the problem, like the men's number 4 would be V11, and we put Daniel and Jimmy on it and Nolly on it, and they would often not do it. Or maybe Chris does it and Daniel doesn't or something.
And as
So
hard
like
as
one
it is,
person can,
as hard as it
yeah,
is to believe, I think for a lot of people, like having climbed with those guys, it's watching them do V11 or V12. They really can, in quite a few circumstances, just really cruise hard V12 and flash. Like it's not.
for sure.
They really can crush it. So it's good to bring that into the realm of comp climb. But I guess I wanted to. So you listen to the Tristan podcast,
Mhm.
and it's interesting hearing, because you guys both have put a lot of thought into grading, and Tristan had this idea around just grading being wholly objective. And I kind of took issue with that. I don't know how much I said during that podcast, and I might have gone into it in the next podcast me and Tim did. I'm not, I think there's, a big spectrum of objective is as a philosopher, that's a very strong word. That's like
Right.
exists, outside of our experience. But, I think if he was here, he might push back against that idea that what is the grades on those comp climbs. It's like, no, there is a grade. And he would argue that there's a right and wrong grade, and that we could pick it apart. Maybe in the future, we'd have more tools to better quantify, but we could say, that was the 11.8, because of X, Y, and Z. And yeah, I don't know. I don't want to, I'm not looking to pitch you guys against each other. Just like it's,
Yeah.
that's a very extreme end of the scale to say like, it's objective that, that was this grade at that day, no arguing. We can try to dive into what it actually is, but fundamentally there is something. And so I don't know, is there anything there you want to pick at?
Oh yeah. So many things that come to mind. Number one, what is a grade? So what does that mean? What that means is that 100 people went and said they felt like it was about this hard, right? So that's, to me, seems completely not objective at all. It's just what people felt like it was to them, and that opinion is also wildly influenced. And I would make the argument that grades have inflated wildly over the last 20 years because there are a number of vectors that are basically pulling grades up, and there's nothing that's necessarily incentivizing people to take lower grades. And so I think that the media, social media, we look at a website like 8A, which maybe isn't as popular as it once was, but people still do use it, and they literally give people points for taking a higher grade. And the only disincentive is that Jens Larsen will say that you're brave and humble, or that you get italics by your name or something, and that's seen as like, if your scorecard is full of italics, that's not desirable or something. But that's I think a mild deterrent compared to the incentive, which is you literally get ranked higher compared to your peers and you get more points. I also think that there is corporate influence from the gyms. The gyms want you to have a nice experience. And I know someone's going to say, well, my gym is the hardest gym. I mean, sure, there are small communities where there are gyms where people grade stiffly. But I think a lot of the big gyms, there's no incentive for the gym to smack people down by setting a 12A and calling it 11B. And in fact, when I worked at Movement, we literally had a route that we would call the Investor 512. That was a little friendly, a little soft. So the gyms, I think, have a monetary incentive to make things softer. And so if you are a kid and you grow up climbing the gym for 10 years, that's what your scale is. That is also softening things. You look at people who like, they repeat a climb and they want to downgrade it. What does the Instagram post look like? I don't want to offend anyone. I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have, I want to give, it's totally apologetic. Does anyone apologize when they take a higher grade? Never. They just take it and they're like, yeah, and everyone goes, you're amazing. So I think that not only are grades not objective because they are people's opinions, but the scale itself, if there's any kind of legitimacy to it, is also inflating all the time. And I think one more point of evidence that I want to bring up for this is, basically the only hard unrepeated problem in Colorado is meat hook, and it's from the 70s. And people will always put up by Jim Holloway. People have gone there. Paul Robinson went there. I went there, tried it. People go there and try it and they go, oh, this is stupid. This is whatever. But no one has done it. And so if you are not repeating a boulder problem from the 70s and you just dismiss it as, oh, it's just dismissive, this isn't cool, I don't like this, it's still a climb that no one has done. And that to me says, well, yeah, you can climb all these boulders with big numbers on them, but are they really that much harder than what was done in the past? And like, there's no evidence to suggest right now that they are, because no one can do the thing that was done in the 70s. Now, do I think that's V17? Probably not. But I do think there is this inflation going on. And if you're a younger climber, it's really hard to see if you don't have the experience to look over a long timeline. And I think there's evidence to suggest that there's incentive vectors that are pushing those grades up all the time. And there's very little that's pushing it down. Man, higher numbers on Instagram means more likes.
Yeah, it's just a Charlie Munger quote. Just don't, what is it? Now I'm going to butcher it, but it's just only pay attention to incentives. Like that is what drives behavior. And yeah, being brave and humble, per Jens Larson. I hope people get that reference. I love that. That was just too good. Yeah, it's really interesting. I know for a fact too that gyms. In fact, I would actually agree with this. Make them soft. Like what, you're at the end of the day for a mega gym like movement. They're trying to sell, birthday parties and stuff, and they're trying to have people have a good time. And although that means that you often get kind of spacked down when you go outdoors, I actually argued that better to get people hooked on climbing and enjoy their thing. Like, I would guess that if you looked at the numbers, if people go once, like the people who go then, take the step and go twice because they had fun are more likely to go 3 times and on and on and on. And I don't have a problem with gyms when they just put up these random climbs to make them soft. Although this could definitely lead into a discussion around, the moon board and, the benchmarks there and the ranking there and on and on.
People say Ben Moon's climbs are really hard. His benchmarks are so hard. That's what they say, right? Like the V4 benchmark is like super hard. The hard times V6 is tough.
Yeah.
I've heard a number of people say, well, the ones that Ben Moon sets are really hard. I'm like, those were the grades.
Dude, I pushed back on this too, where people say it's really, really hard. And I'm not so sure it is. I think it's a style that people don't love. I also think it's a style I happen to be good at. So I do well on the moon board, but I like do a problem. And it reminds me of when we would do spray wall sessions where we'd have a really small spray wall and we would be, climbing on it mainly because we had done the other hard problems. So our friends would come to us and they'd say, okay, Josh, like I did this V10 over here, could you set me a V10 here or a V9? I'd like to climb with you guys. And we'd climb something. We'd be like, this is about V9, but it would be like a 2-move V9. And they would think like, oh, this is impossible. And I'm like, they're like, no way is this V9. This is like V11. I'm like, it's not like it. I know you can't do it. I know you think it's really hard, but you go on the moon board and typically it's like easy 1 move. And you go like, okay, that was a V8 move and V8 moves are freaking hard, but that doesn't mean it's not a V8. And yes, that's kind of my hot take.
So one thing I know that people will push back on is they'll say, you're just an old crusty climber who thinks that your generation was stronger or something. And I'm not necessarily making a judgment that the grade, like I think the grades are inflating. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. I just think I'm pointing it out. And then I'm also saying that in terms of like an objective, I know climbers want a metric, right? They want to know am I improving? What climb should I get on? I think grades at their best are a guideline to like, oh, this would be a nice thing that would be kind of challenging. Maybe I could do it in a day. That's a really nice use of grades. But in terms of an objective measure, we certainly, I don't think we have, I mean, maybe Tristan would argue that there's technology that will happen in the future where we can measure forces, total force exerted on the climb or something that would give us a relative, a grade or something. But we don't have that now. Grades are just your opinion. I also, two quick points I want to make is that I think that just because there are bigger numbers doesn't mean climbers are stronger. I think that climbers are stronger, but I don't think the evidence for that is that there are more bigger numbers. So I just want to kind of point that out as a philosophical point.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that there was a climber, Michele Caminati. He was a very good climber. I think he got in a car accident. He's fine. He's alive, but he kind of got derailed a little bit from his climbing. But he was a mathematician, and he presented a grading philosophy that I've never heard anyone else talk about, which I think is really interesting. And it basically looked at, if we take a random sample of a climber, what's the probability that they're going to climb this boulder problem? So if we have something like High Plains Drifter, which is a very, I don't know how many ascents are on Kaya or 8A or whatever, or how many total ascents it has. But what would, if we have 20,000 people, 10,000 people that have climbed it, what's the probability that we pick one of those climbers and they're going to do it? And then we can basically make a probability distribution. And we would look at something like Burden of Dreams. And it's, let's say there's 10 million climbers in the world. 2 people can do that. So the probability would be 2 out of 10 million. And that would actually give us it would actually give us real information on how likely someone is to climb. And he presented that idea, and he had all the math for it, which is pretty awesome. But he presented that idea, obviously it didn't catch on at all. But I thought it was really interesting because it felt like it was, instead of just asking people how they feel about something, because if I told you to run a mile, Josh, and I said, well, I'm not going to tell you exactly how long the mile is, and I'm also not going to tell you when to stop, but just whenever you feel like you've run a mile, you can just tell me. People would think that was totally ridiculous, right? They would be like, oh, this is and then there'd be some guy who would run half a mile and be like, well, I ran a mile, I'd probably a mile. So that's kind of I feel like that's kind of an analogy for the way the grading scale works right now. And it's really hard to sort out. And so I thought that Michele's mathematical probability equation was pretty interesting in terms of
that's not bad.
Getting actual. We never had the numbers to do it, right? We never had enough people. It was always like, well, I don't know, maybe 100 people have climbed High Plains Drifter, but I think now there's so many people that have done it that we could actually take a sample.
Yeah, God, the data. I'm definitely I don't know if I'm a data guy or a data nerd, but I see the potential. And I think that's one of the attractions of things like the moon board, where you go, okay, like now we have a very constrained data set. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I think it intuitively makes sense because, something happened where Sean Rabatou did Alphane, and then like 3 other people did it. We go like, whoa. Like maybe this isn't
Right.
V17. But it also makes me think of Hypnotized Minds, where it's like, okay, Daniel does Hypnotized Minds, and then people try it. It's right there. It's, by the way, right off the road. Beautiful line, very accessible. And then Rustum, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm a little hazy now, but I remember Rustum coming and just kind of doing it pretty quickly. But the argument there would be on this probability curve, like Rustum is a very unique kind of climber. He's very small, very strong fingers, and an incredible climb. I don't want, dude, he's incredible, but it just actually gives credence to that like kind of idea where, okay, yeah, but that still means it's hard because this one guy who kind of, I don't want to say specializes in that, but it wasn't stunning, I don't think, to the climbing community when he did it.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting case in points. I think the mathematical kind of take on it would account for all that, right? It'd be totally random sample. So you would include people who are specifically attuned to that climb, and there'd be a lot of people who are specifically not attuned to that climb equally. I also think that there is the in-between solution would be, we take an app like Kaya and you allow people this is kind of ridiculous, but you basically encourage a system where, hey, when you do a boulder problem, you're going behind the voting booth. No one sees what you write, and you just give your honest opinion about what you think it is. If you think paint it black is V12, then you just put that down. And it's your private voting booth. You get to submit your opinion. And then we look at the consensus, and that's what it is. And it takes all the climbers to agree that, yes, I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to try to take more points. I think they're incentivized to take more points, but I think there could be a space there for people to kind of privately, hey, we encourage you to say whatever you want. If you think it's V7, call it V7. If you think it's V10, call it V10. And then they submit, and then we actually have a consensus. It's still not an objective measure by any means.
It does really help climbing with a bunch of different types of climbers who excel at different things, where I have some pretty glaring weaknesses. And I would say I'm also really damn good at some specific types of climbing. And it's helped me, like, I'll climb on something that's V9 and I will just think to myself, Jesus, this is hard. Like, I just think like if you had to tell, I would be like, no, this is like the hardest thing I've ever been on or climbed. But the grade doesn't get that. And it's tricky because as I would set more and spend more times with people who excelled at that, I would say, you know what, this is V9. It's just really hard for me.
Yeah. I think, one example I used to use is I went to Waco. I spent months in Waco a long time ago, and I kind of set out to climb as many V9s as I could. And that was just a random grade, but there were a lot of good ones. And I was like, I just want to climb all of them. And so I didn't climb every V9 in Waco by any means, but I climbed a number of them. And what I found was some were flash, some went down a couple tries, some took 3 days. And I was like, there is a gigantic spectrum. Oftentimes people seek out the climb that they know that it kind of fits them. They have strong fingers, so they're going to go try Frogger or something. And then they do it in 5 tries and go, V9 is not that bad. But if you climbed all the V9s, or you climbed a sample of 20 of them, you would find that, yeah, maybe you're really good at Frogger, but something else that's really slopey, like I think there's a problem called Try Hard, which is like extremely slopey and big pinches. Really difficult, totally opposite styles. So when I climbed all of them, I was like, wow, there's a big spectrum of what V9 could be. And if I just went to Waco and got on the things I think I would do fast, I would have climbed 5 V9s flash, and I would have been like, oh, Waco's soft, or this is easy, or whatever. But it's also hard to account for that spectrum, which I think it should account for a spectrum. Like, every V10 can't be ridiculously hard. We have to have V10s that are like, okay, that's not the hardest V10, but you get 10 points for that. But I think that's interesting when you start really delving into kind of a bigger and bigger tick list. At a certain grade, you'll find that some are not so bad and some are really hard. And how does that fit into it?
So I got to ask, what is the best V9 in Waco, and maybe what's the softest and which one was the hardest for you?
I think Frogger is probably, for me, was probably the softest. The French Tickler is the best one. I think that one gets the most stars.
Yes, good.
I love that one. I think you're talking to Eric. I don't know. Eric mentioned that maybe Eric Jerome, that maybe you were speaking with him. I hope that he talks about the star system and the quality. I think the French Tickler would get a lot of stars. I think it's a great boulder problem.
I did that one weirdly. I did some kind of weird dyno move. I don't think maybe I didn't do the French Tickler. The namesake match. I did a Gaston or something, and then I did
not do the match. I did there's a really bad crimp out right, and I just grabbed that and put my foot up and locked it off and went left hand to the thing.
I think I went up right hand to the. Yeah, there's a video somewhere on YouTube of me doing that. It was awesome. Oh man. Yeah. Damn.
Wow, Waco's great.
And
it's interesting to see how. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we've talked about grade inflation. Something that I've pointed out about Waco that I thought was interesting is I would argue that in some ways, just because I know you're in technology as well, technology we think of as deflationary. And the reason why I bring that up is that I've argued in the past that people have called Waco soft. And the thing is that Waco got established when there weren't a lot of climbing gyms, and a roof is very difficult to find, and the technique on the roof is very difficult. But if you grew up like I did, climbing on a bunch of steep stuff, in the gym, all of a sudden that roof, I'm like, oh, these are jugs. Like, it's no big deal. Just heel hook your way through it. And so we've seen some grades on classics come down in Waco due to the new technology of climbing gyms. And I just find it interesting. It's just a little, side note that sometimes grades can be pulled down, like I'm sure dynos got pulled down when everyone started dynoing everything, all of a sudden that, V12 dyno is like, it's like V7, you guys, like that wasn't that bad.
That's a really great observation because I think that you're absolutely right. When I started climbing, it was hard to find a cave anywhere in a gym to go climb in, and the caves often weren't really great. And then suddenly, slowly over time, there was a shift where people only wanted to climb in the cave, and they only wanted to climb on steep stuff, and that shifted the perception of what's difficult and what's not difficult. And so, when that perception of difficulty shifts, how does an objective like grades couldn't possibly be, because people would feel that Waco was really hard when they started going there, and then now they would feel like it was really easy because they're basically climbing on moonboards, and then they go to Waco, which is kind of moonboardy. So they would feel, oh, this isn't that bad because this is all I've trained on. But then they may find something like Meat Hook, which is not like Waco, the problem at Horsetooth that's unrepeated, as being extremely difficult because that's not the style they're training at. So all those things are like swirling around as we move through time. And like, how do we say in any way possible that objectively this is V15?
I like that we got the villain saying grades are objective. We got the sheriff saying grades are subjective, and clearly that's I joke about pitting you guys on each side of the spectrum, and it's because it's always somewhere in the middle there, right? Where and I shouldn't say that you are wholly on the subjective side, but I'm more on the subjective side because we're the one that imbue meaning into that rock by defining what if we're going to define what the boulder is, then clearly we've already arbitrarily put constraints, and so then anything we do deeper into there is kind of us applying our grading system onto it. But maybe Tristan will come back and have a rebuttal against that. Tristan, put it in the comments.
I think I really appreciate Tristan's opinions, and I think it's awesome. I'd always prefer someone to have thought through something and come to some conclusion that we can then kind of toss about intellectually. I think and as long as we can be mature about it, then that's great. I think that's awesome. And I think I would much rather hear that than kind of a watered down, saturated Instagram post about how everything's amazing and they love climbing. Tristan's clearly put thought into it, and I appreciate that. I think that's awesome. Yeah. So there's a lot to talk about with grades.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Well, but hopefully we've provided like this balanced, there's this love of climbing. I mean, dude, clearly you spend tons of time out there finding new boulders, contributing to the community in that way, loving the outdoors, loving the feeling of moving over a rock and moving your body. And I'd love, diving into the grading aspect. I love it all, and that's why I'm glad that we got to come on, and this idea of you being the sheriff as someone who might call one out for starting at the wrong place, quote unquote, is not really what it's all about. It's all about having opinions, discussing them, honing our opinions. I mean, nothing hones your opinion better than explaining it, articulating it, and then hearing other people disagree. And as long as we can, do that in a constructive way, then it's actually fun instead of some kind of shouting match or ego thing. It's just like, hey, this is fun, you guys, let's talk about it.
And I really, I think Instagram's a terrible place to have those debates. It's awful. Tone is lost. It's just no place to do it. And so I think allowing people to speak in a long form conversation is really, you can really at least touch the iceberg that may be there on what climbing is for people, how they flesh out their ideas, how they think about things, what they actually think. So yeah, it's awesome.
Okay, well, let's actually start wrapping up here. I'm going to give you a couple of quote unquote rapid fire. We'll see how that goes, but they're just ones I just can't resist. Actually, this one is Max's question. Is what's the best boulder in the U.S. that no one knows about or doesn't talk? He may have said no one knows about, but my general sense would be kind of like the underrated boulder problem that's actually amazing. And I don't care about the grade, or what I mean is it could be a hard one or an easy one. Yeah. What comes to mind
I'm
there?
going to say the Revenant, which is a boulder problem that Jimmy put up. Jimmy Webb and I and our good friend Davin, a couple other people went into the Wind Rivers. We have backpacked in 9-10 miles, right in heart of grizzly country. Jimmy put up a V15 roof. It's amazing.
Is
I
there a
would say
video of
that's one
that?
of the most.
Isn't there a
There
video of
is.
that? Okay, cool.
There
I'll
is.
try
If
to
it
find
was a
that and
video,
link
does
that.
that not count?
No, because there's videos of everything nowadays, but that's cool. God, it's so freaking hard to backpack out in the middle of nowhere and establish a
Yeah.
V15. He's such a beast. Yeah, Jimmy,
we
good
t- we
job.
took we went 2 years to the same boulder. There are a lot of other boulders around, but 2 years the same boulder, horse packed in, and Jimmy cut his finger really badly the first year. Came back the next year to do it. Super awesome. The
I
Revenant
do know
actually
that. Yeah.
coming back to life. A Revenant, just the definition is basically like a corpse that's been reanimated, but brought back to life. And so I think Jimmy kind of felt like this was dead and then brought back to life. But amazing, beautiful roof, uncontrived, obvious start, just an amazing boulder problem.
Very
Beautiful
cool.
setting over a lake. Yeah, this rapid fire with Jamie is not good.
No, it's good. It's good. Okay, what about your favorite boulder and why?
My favorite boulder is the Hunter, which is a boulder problem that I put up on the Colorado-Wyoming border. It's a sandstone problem, and it's V12. It's a singular line. I went alone to this mountain, maybe 15 days, hiked up 1,000-foot mountain. And some days I would do them hike twice. So I take 3 pads, hike up 1,000 feet, come back down to my car, grab 3 more pads, hike up 1,000 feet. There were bears and elk in the forest. I was always up on a rope. It's kind of tall. I was up on a rope alone, and just a beautiful expression, I think, for me artistically of like what I want to pursue in climbing. So I don't think anyone really goes there. It was almost the problem I said for the unheralded one, but I don't think anyone really goes there. But it's beautiful. It's awesome.
Any
And
pictures or
it's named
videos?
after I could share a picture. It is named after my friend Davin, who is, I think, the best boulder hunter that I know. And he found the boulder. So it's called the Hunter in honor of Davin.
Last one, just because it's the namesake of the podcast. What do you think makes Boulder a test piece?
What makes a boulder a test piece? It has to be a classic problem. It has to have some easy access, I think, because Jimmy's problem is amazing. It's beautiful. It's going to be hard for people to test themselves against it. So for it to be in a well-traveled location, I think it needs to have a lot of stars. So it needs to have a flat landing. It's helpful if it's an obvious start. It's helpful for a lot of people to have done it. And I think typically it would also incorporate maybe a little bit of scariness, or there's something kind of a little spicier about it. Like I think a Midnight Lightning is a classic test piece. And yes, it's a V8. It's a tough for the grade. It seems like that's kind of a pattern for a test piece. And then also it's got that mantle, which technically probably is V4, V5, but it is spicy when you're up there for the first time. And I think that is a key component of a test piece.
Well said. I love it. All right, Jamie. I think the other award we may get on this podcast is probably the longest one yet. Just absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm so glad through the magic of podcasting we got to connect, and I'm gonna be really enjoying finding all the gems in this podcast to share on Instagram and just to reflect on. There was more questions, but I gotta tell you, I'm getting tired. My wife is about to kick me out of the office. Really fun. Jamie, thanks for everything you do in climbing. You've contributed a huge amount, and it shows. And when we talked, I think your knowledge of climbing, your insightfulness was just really wonderful. And if there's anything you want to leave the listeners with, anything about stewardship or anything that comes to mind that we didn't say, feel free to let them know. Otherwise, we can just maybe do a round 2 at a later date.
Yeah, first of all, that's very humbling, and thank you. I really appreciate you even considering that you would have me on your podcast. So thank you so much for that. It was great to get to know you and just have this conversation and be able to flesh out my ideas in a long form. So thank you. I appreciate that. And if I was going to leave anyone with anything, I would say, there's a saying that goes something like, "You're not in traffic, you are traffic." And so if you are concerned about the access that these areas that we climb at, no one can do more than you can. So if anyone that steps up to help, make a donation to the Access Fund, go out to a local cleanup, all that stuff is always appreciated and goes a long way towards building good relationships with the land managers. So I'll leave you with that.
That's a really good reminder. Yeah, give back to the community. I think that as you get older, you appreciate that more and more. I just love those people who make trails, clean up, and no matter how good you are, you think you pack it all out, that little piece of tape fell off, fell in the dirt, got covered up. You thought were good, but we always make an impact. So thanks for reminding everyone of that. And thanks again, Jamie. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to learn more about Testpiece climbing, you can check us out at testpiececlimbing.com and even book a session with one of our coaches.